Here's what's coming up on the program today. Russia begins its so-called pre-planned military drills in Belarus amid rising tensions with Ukraine. Car makers hit hard by the truckers' protest in Ottawa, Canada. It has gone on for almost 2 weeks. Last former UK Prime Minister John Major takes a swipe at the government under current Prime Minister Boris Johnson. A warm welcome to the program today. I am Amarachi Ubani in Lagos. Russia is said to be a few dozen miles from the Ukrainian border, so says an investigative reporter on the ground with a conflict intelligence team. Kirill Mikhailov says equipment including Iskander missile systems were moved from Siberia to Russia's Bryansk region in April last year and is now located near Ukraine's Chernihiv region. In the meantime, world leaders continue to push for a diplomatic solution with Boris Johnson in Poland today. Indeed, the shuttle diplomacy continues. Today, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson arrived in Warsaw, Poland, where he held talks about tensions with Russia before traveling to a military base to meet NATO armed forces, including UK troops. During a press conference with his Polish counterpart, Mr. Johnson said the UK and Poland would not accept a world in which a powerful neighbour can bully or attack its neighbours.
We won't accept, Poland and the UK won't accept a world in which a powerful neighbour can bully or attack their neighbours. And we won't accept it because we believe all people, no matter where they are born, have a right to live safely and choose who governs them and to decide what organisations they aspire to have membership of, or indeed what bodies they want to cease being members of. And we will not compromise on that principle.
Earlier, he had met NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg at NATO headquarters in Brussels, who warned Europe was at the most dangerous moment in the security crisis between Russia and Ukraine.
This is a dangerous moment for European security. The number of Russian forces is going up. The warning time for a possible attack is going down. NATO is not a threat to Russia, but we must be prepared for the worst, while remaining strongly committed to finding a political solution.
Mr. Stoltenberg further said Russia must choose between diplomatic solution to the crisis over Ukraine or face economic sanctions from the West and an increased military presence of NATO forces in the alliance's eastern countries. British Foreign Minister Liz Truss, meeting with her Russian counterpart today, also warned Russia that an invasion of Ukraine will be disastrous for Russia, Ukraine and Europe and carry severe costs. Russia today started the active phase of military drills in Belarus. Footage released by the Russian Defense Ministry showed tanks and missile launchers being used in the drills and military jets in the air in the unidentified Belarus drill location. US officials also warned that Russia may attack Ukraine after massing troops near its border and have accused Moscow of raising tensions further by holding joint military exercises in Belarus with what NATO says is Russia's biggest deployment to the country since the Cold War. Russia denies planning an attack and says it has a right to move its troops as it sees fit across its own territory and that of its allies with the agreement. It says military exercises are defensive in nature. Ukraine, on the other hand, is preparing a response to Russian Navy drills in the Black Sea. 6 Russian warships were heading to the Black Sea from the Mediterranean for naval drills in what it said was a pre-planned movement of military resources. The Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba says all sides need to show political will to end the crisis between Ukraine and Russia. The VOA's Ricardo Makina is in Moscow. Ricardo, what sort of information is Russian media feeding the population about what's going on at the border with Ukraine?
Hello, thank you for having me. So the Russian population is getting the exactly opposite information. So all the movement of troops in Russia and in the neighbor Belarus is only the response of Russian response to the movement of NATO in the NATO countries. in the border, especially in Poland, in Romania, and Bulgaria, in the Baltics. So if we watch the federal Russian channels, the information is exactly that. Russia is reacting to the approaching of the NATO forces to his borders.
So the sounds of war are getting louder, Ricardo. Now, one journalist on the ground said the Russian troops are only just a few miles from the border with Ukraine. The UK now adding its voice with the Prime Minister, who is in Poland currently, saying Russia would be making a foolish and catastrophic mistake of invading Ukraine and that the Ukrainian army would fight and there would be bloodshed. Where does this leave the diplomatic moves made by the French president earlier this week with Russia's president and the Ukrainian president?
Oh, I think these two facts they can live together. I mean, there are here a play between the diplomacy and the military pressure. So Russia is obviously showing his muscle, his military muscle, but in the same time is having these diplomatic contacts, especially with Macron these last days. So is the way that Moscow have to put pressure in Ukraine, especially also in NATO, because the final goal of Russia is not Ukraine. The final goal of Russia is to push NATO back of the Russian borders.
To push NATO back from the Russian borders. A lot of Ukrainians are saying there will be no war. Some are even not fazed by Russia's moves, as saying that Russia does not want a war. So maybe, that really counts. But what is it looking like to you, Ricardo? Is there no turning back from the heightened tension between the two countries?
Of course, the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, they are broken. For how long it will be? Decades. I assume that it's broken for a long time. So the trust is broken after the Crimea and Donbass war, and now all this tension shows that it will be for long time. So there are places for negotiation. It's true, but the point is the only negotiation that Russia will accept is to prevent Ukraine to be part of NATO. So it's the only way that Russia will accept to put back his troops off the border. So finally, it means a loss of some kind of sovereignty of the Ukrainian people.
And just so we understand, the UK troops in Poland, US troops are beefing up deployments in parts of Europe. Should there be an attack by Russia, would they be fighting on behalf of Ukraine? I mean, NATO has said Ukraine is not part of NATO yet, and NATO is not putting boots on the ground, for the purpose of fighting on behalf of Ukraine. So would these other allies be fighting on Ukraine's behalf?
It's difficult to speculate what will be happening in this terrible situation. But for the words of NATO, I assume that they will be back. They will go back maybe to Poland or to Bulgaria. I don't think that will be a direct confrontation between NATO soldiers and Russian troops in Ukraine. This will be extremely dangerous, not only for Ukraine but for all the continent.
Ricardo, thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you.
And so the impact of the truckers' protests in Canada is beginning to hit hard at the country's automobile industry. Car makers Ford and Toyota say production has been disrupted by protests. Plants have been forced to shut because car parts are being held up at 2 U.S. border points blocked by truckers protesting against a vaccine mandate in Canada. A trade disruption is estimated to be costing about $300 million a day.
COVID-19 restrictions at the heart of many ongoing protests in Canada have paralyzed the capital city, Ottawa, for nearly 2 weeks, while truckers further south have blocked one of the busiest border crossings into the United States. The so-called Freedom Convoy protests in Ottawa is calling for Canada's pandemic measures, including a cross-border vaccine mandate, to be removed. Truckers and other vehicles have overwhelmed Ottawa's Parliament Hill. The downtown area has been paralyzed.
I'm not going anywhere. whatever. I made some phone calls and I rearranged my life, and it's going to be what it's going to be. But me and most of these other men here, and some women too, we're resolved, man. We're not going anywhere.
You can't end a pandemic with blockades.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was in Parliament on Wednesday, where he condemned opposition members for supporting the 13-day demonstration.
Mr. Speaker, you cannot stop a pandemic with blockades. You cannot end a pandemic by decree. You can't end a pandemic by legislation. You need to end a pandemic by relying on science, by public health measures, and by vaccinations. That's exactly what we have focused on through these past 2 years. And even as Canadians are tired and impatient for it to end, we are going to continue to be there for them, to support them through it, and to make sure we do everything necessary to end this pandemic.
Protesters say they are peaceful, but some Ottawa residents claim they were attacked and harassed. In Toronto, streets are being blocked as well. The issue has caused a sharp split between the ruling Liberals and the opposition Conservatives, many of whom have expressed open support for the protesters in Ottawa and accused the Prime Minister of using the issue to mandate for political protests. Trucks in Canada are being diverted to the Blue Water Bridge in Michigan, the United States, as the inbound Canada traffic at the Ambassador Bridge has been shut by truckers. The bridge is a major supply route for Detroit's car makers and agricultural products. Another border crossing, Alberta province, has been closed in both directions since late Tuesday. The bridge closure has already caused a shortage of parts at carmaker Stellantis assembly plant in Windsor, Ontario. The company said it had to end shifts early on Tuesday, but the plant was able to resume production Wednesday morning. The auto industry is also struggling with the lack of semiconductor chips worldwide. The anti-vaccine protests are holding in other countries as well. Protesters gathered in southern France on Wednesday for what they said would be a freedom convoy that will converge in Paris and Brussels to demand an end to COVID-19 restrictions inspired by the protesters who have blocked major border crossings. About 200 protesters assembled in a parking lot in Nice on France's Mediterranean coast, with many displaying flags in a nod to the truckers in Canada. And more than 50 people were arrested in New Zealand today, with scores of police officers from around the country brought in to assist with clearing hundreds of protesters cramped outside the Parliament building. The protesters have been camped in the area for the last 3 days to protest COVID-19 mandates and tough coronavirus restrictions. They too were inspired by the truckers' protest in Canada.
We'll have more on COVID-19 after the break. Plus, age is nothing but a number. Just ask Priscilla Centennial, who went back to school, private school that is, at the age of 99. Do stay with us. More countries in Europe are scrapping coronavirus restrictions. Take Spain, for instance. The country lifted a requirement to wear face masks outdoors as infections continue to recede from record heights. Here's more on the situation around the world in our global update.
Spain has lifted the requirement to wear face masks outdoors as COVID-19 infections continue to recede from record heights. Masks are still mandatory in enclosed spaces and on public transport, but almost all regions have lifted requirements to show a COVID passport to enter bars and nightclubs. South Korea has announced that patients with mild coronavirus symptoms will have to treat themselves. This new strategy aims to free up medical resources for more serious cases as the Omicron variant continues to spread. Authorities will only provide care to COVID-19 patients aged 60 and older or with underlying conditions, while others monitor themselves and seek medical help from designated clinics if their conditions worsen. the daily count of cases in the country has surged more than twofold in less than a week. Long queues formed outside of a Hong Kong community vaccination center earlier today, with many waiting to receive their first doses amid an Omicron-fueled spike in new COVID-19 cases and looming vaccine passes. Unvaccinated residents will be barred from Hong Kong's supermarkets and malls from February the 24th as city officials use vaccine passes to beat back a record outbreak of COVID-19. Britain's Prince Charles has tested positive for COVID-19. It's the second time that the heir to the throne has contracted the disease. The 73-year-old, who said in December both he and his wife Camilla had received their COVID vaccine booster shots, previously tested positive in March 2020 when he said he had been lucky to have suffered only mild symptoms. He spent 7 days in self-isolation at his Birkhall home in Scotland before resuming his duties.
Well, we'll be back to Britain in a bit, but hundreds of Afghans listed to be evacuated to the United Arab Emirates last year have been protesting against the move. After the U.S. withdrew from the country and the Taliban took over Kabul, thousands of Afghans were sent to the UAE on behalf of some of those of the U.S. Some who remain there are protesting the move, now saying they should be sent to the U.S. instead. At the time of the chaos, the UAE agreed to provide housing until refugees could continue on to another country, but many Afghans remain in strict facilities. In September, the UAE said 9,000 Afghan nationals were evacuated, though it is unclear how many remain in the facilities today. For Afghan refugees within the U.S., the government has attempted to resettle people through Operation Allies Welcome. Last month, the last group of Afghan refugees left military bases in Indiana and in New Mexico. At the time, the Department of Defense was still housing 9,000 other refugees at 3 more military bases, including Fort McCoy in Wisconsin, Fort Pickett in Vancouver, and Joint Base McGuire in New Jersey. To British politics, former Prime Minister John Major has accused current Prime Minister Boris Johnson of making government look distinctly shifty and ultimately undermining democracy by dreaming up brazen excuses, he says, to explain away reports of COVID-19 lockdown breaking events. Mr. Johnson is facing the gravest crisis yet since becoming Prime Minister in 2019 over a steady drip of reports of boozy events in his Downing Street office and residence when Britain was under strict coronavirus restrictions. He has refused growing calls, including from some in his own governing Conservative Party, to quit, asking lawmakers to wait for a police investigation to conclude whether the law was broken and promising to reshape his administration. Mr. Major, who's also Conservative, who was Prime Minister between 1990 and 1997, accused Johnson's administration of undermining government at home and abroad by using a raft of excuses to try to defend the Prime Minister and challenging the rule of law.
At number 10, the Prime Minister and officials broke lockdown laws. Brazen excuses were dreamed up. Day after day, the public was asked to believe the unbelievable. Ministers were sent out to defend the indefensible, making themselves look gullible or foolish as they did so. Collectively, this has made the government look distinctly shifty, which has consequences that go far beyond political unpopularity. No government can function properly if its word is treated with suspicion. A recent report by the Constitutional Unit of UCL tells us that the public trusts the courts more than the civil service more than Parliament, and Parliament more than the Prime Minister. The lack of trust in the elected portion of our democracy cannot be brushed aside. Parliament has a duty to address this and correct this. And if it does not, and trust is lost at home, our politics is in no man's land, in disarray, broken. If trust in our word is lost overseas, we may no longer be able to work effectively with friends and partners for mutual benefit or even security.
Finally, on the program today, how old is too old to be in school? Is 99 too old? I don't think so for Priscilla Seteni. She's the oldest primary school pupil in grade 6 at a school in Kenya's Rift Valley. She wants to achieve the goal of a lifetime, which is to pass her exams, obtain her diploma, and become a doctor.
In a stone classroom in rural Kenya's Rift Valley, 99-year-old Priscilla Seteni takes notes alongside her fellow pupils who are all more than 8 decades younger than her. Wearing her school uniform, Seteni, who is in her 6th year of primary schooling, says she went back to class to set a good example for her great-grandchildren and to pursue a new career.
When I mentioned to my children that I was going back to school, none of them opposed the idea. Their only worry was how I was going to be able to read the text on my books. Then I told them that I was going to be diligent and learn how to write, step by step, under the teacher's guidance.
The government of the East African nation began subsidizing the cost of primary schooling in 2003, allowing some older members of society who had missed out on education in their younger days to revive their dreams. This catapulted some of the elderly pupils into stardom, including Seteni, who traveled to Paris last year for the launch of a film about her journey titled Gogo Priscilla. Gogo means grandma in her native Kalenjin language. But Seteni says her aims were far more practical than becoming a movie star.
I would like to become a doctor because I used to be a midwife.
Her teachers tap her wide experience to keep the peace during lessons.
I make her to be my class monitor, looking for the noisemakers in class. So she managed to do that work. When I go outside, the class will remain silent. When I am not there, Gogo is doing that and telling them, let us read, let us read. So I find it was something which is actually motivative to me and the pupils.
Apart from learning, the 99-year-old says she also enjoys other school activities, including physical education classes, because although she can't jump as much as the children, it keeps her fit. She hopes her story will be an example to others that no matter their age, they can achieve anything they want to.
What an inspiration. Thanks, Gogo Seteni, for teaching us that. And that's the world today. Thanks for watching. I'm Amarachi Ubani.